Welcome to this presentation. I'm Matt Stading. I'm a professor in material science and I work at RISE Research Institutes of Sweden and Chalmers University of Technology. Today I will talk about bolus rheology, especially of texture-modified foods. The background for this topic is that we are getting older and older. It's actually good that we're getting older, but a lot of problems associated with age also gets more and more important, and we need to deal with them. Frailty is one thing, and that is often caused by you don't get enough food intake, especially you don't get enough protein and energy. And this leads to malnutrition, which in turn leads to weight loss and sarcopenia, so you lose muscles, then you become weaker, then you have fall accidents, you often end up in a nursing home or in a hospital, and you can even die from this. So the message here is that older seniors need to eat more. One reason for that you don't eat enough is dysphagia or swallowing disorders, and they can be caused by numerous different causes, by neurological diseases or side effects of medication. But it affects a lot of us, and it's as much as 40% of the ones who are older than 70. So a lot of us will experience this. And you can see in the two videos here, on the bottom one is normal, healthy swallowing, and the upper one shows aspiration, where part of the food or the drinks go into the airways, which is quite dangerous in the long run. So I'm going to focus on solid foods, and swallowing disorders is not a good combination because you have pieces that can get aspirated into the lungs. Many people have difficulties to choose. So one solution is that you mash the food, but that is not very appealing. So that also leads to people not eating enough. So what we can do is that we can modify the food for those who have problems. And every country has their own different classes of modifications. I'm going to talk about the Swedish system. So the first modification is called the pâté, which is softer, but it still contains pieces. Then we have timbales, which are even softer and no pieces. And if you have big problems, you have gelled foods, which basically melt in the mouth. But timbales are the ones that you can see on the pictures. They are absolutely the most common ones, and they are available in a wide range of different types commercially. And you make them in the way that you homogenize the food, you mix it with eggs and starch, and then you reshape them into food that is moist and easy to chew with. Even if you don't have teeth, you can press it between the tongue and the palate, and it also keeps together when you're swallowing it. You can see in the picture that they still have some texture, but it's easy to mash them or to eat them actually. So we were focusing on a set of foods in this study to look at the bolus properties, and then we choose bread, cheese and tomato, which can all be eaten cold, and the combination of these into a sandwich. And then we looked at the different classes from regular foods to timbale to gelled food. You can see pictures of how they look here, and there are only two of the cheeses because the timbale cheese is a soft processed cheese, and that is used both for the gel diet and for the timbale diet. We have first studied the parameters of the food, and then we have looked at the bolus properties, because it's really the bolus properties that are important and not the food properties, because it's the bolus that should pass easily and safely down the food tract. So is it related or not? That's what we wanted to study, and what is actually the bolus properties when it comes to physical properties and flow properties. So we had 5 healthy subjects, and we asked them to chew until they wanted to spit, until they wanted to swallow, and then we asked them to spit out the bolus, and then we measured the bolus properties. So the parameters we measured were physiology-related, like how much moisture do you have in the bolus, how much saliva, how many times do you chew before you swallow. Then we measured bolus properties, viscosity and linear viscoelasticity. And we also measured the physical level of the subjects, so we can later on compare to other groups. These were 5 healthy young subjects, and after the virus restrictions, we are going to measure also on older subjects. So, well, a quick word on bolus rheology. That is not easy. It's quite a challenge because the bolus is not homogeneous. You could have some pieces depending on how you chew. You have edge fracture, you have a very linear viscoelastic region. You have to reach temperature equilibrium in a short time before you can measure. But with some tricks and good knowledge about how to set up the rheological experiment, you can actually make good measurements also on boluses. So these are the results I will show you of this form. So I will show you the different classes, regular, thimble and gel. And there are results from the 5 topics on each, from the 5 subjects. And you have the different foods, bread, cheese, tomato, and the combination into sandwich. And in this case, I show you the properties of how much you needed to chew before swallowing and the saliva content of the bolus. So in general, you can see that the properties decrease the more you modify the food, which is what we want really. We want to have less chewing of a more modified food. And of course that for a gel that is obvious, but you can see that it decreases in general with the more you modify the food. Also the saliva content, which is important as many elderly have dry mouth for different reasons, and then less saliva. So less saliva is needed the more you modify the food. There are of course also personal variation, as we are individuals and we chew in a different way, and we have different salivary flow, we have different liking of foods, and all these factors play a role. This is the salivary flow of the subjects, and that can explain some of the differences, but far from all. So there are many aspects you need to take into account when you try to explain the variability between the subjects. Okay, so these are the rheological data, and it's a lot of diagram, but I'll walk you through it. You have the measured parameters. You have G prime, which is the storage modulus, which is the stiffness of the bolus. You have the phase angle, which gives an indication of the character of the bolus. If it's high, it's fluid-like. If it's low, it's solid-like. You have the shear viscosity, and you have the extensional viscosity. And extensional viscosity was measured on the food mixed with the saliva substitute, because we need much more than people really can spit to be able to measure the extensional viscosity. But we mixed it at the same amounts of saliva as the subjects did with the real boluses. We still have 5 subjects here in the first bars. Then I have also added the average over all the subjects, as well as where it's possible, the value for the actual food compared to the bolus values. So also here in general, we can see that the rheological properties decrease the more you modify the food. If you look at the phase angle, that is more constant, and it's also, I mean, it doesn't have the same variation between the subjects, which I interpret as a sign of that the body tries to make a bolus that is easy to swallow, irrespective of if it's a dry cracker or if it's a humid gel or a moist gel. So that sort of even out the differences, and it seems to also even out the differences between the subjects when you compare to the other parameters. You can also see that the sandwich had a little bit different in the phase angle compared to the other ones. But more important is that if you compare the values for the sandwich compared to the individual components, you can see that the modulus is almost always lower if you compare the combination of the foods, the sandwich, to the individual ones. The same with the viscosity. And that means that it's easier and safer to swallow if you combine the components than if you have the single ones. You can see, of course, there are variations here. The trends don't really apply for always, that you have a decrease with the increased modification. For example, if you look at the tomatoes, if you have a regular tomato, that's sort of a crispy tissue, which is basically cells, vegetable cells. And then you have the thimble, which is made like all the other thimbles. You reconstitute the mashed tomato. And the gel is really a gelatin gel. So these are very different. So they are more different to compare. And also, so you don't see the same trends depending on the food itself, always. You can also see that the timbals have really constant or consistent values, which is not too strange because you make them in the same way. So most of the properties comes from what you do with the reconstitution of the starch and the egg that you form. And you can also modify it so it actually becomes consistent. Okay, so in conclusion, if we look at bolus properties compared to the texture modification of the foods, it seems, well, the texture modification works, which is not so unexpected as this has been developed over time and with very much experience. So you do need less saliva and you need to chew less if you modify the food, if you look at the bolus. If you also measure the bolus properties, the viscosity and the modulus is lower the more you modify it, which means that it's safer and probably also more pleasant to swallow. What was not really expected was that if you look at the composite food with all the components, the sandwich in this case, you require less saliva than you do on the individual components. And we think that in this case the cheese plays a major role because the fat in the cheese makes it easier to swallow, so you can probably also need to chew less because the bolus properties are what they should be when you swallow them. And further, if you want to measure rheology of boluses, you really have to be careful, but with a good experimental setup and some tricks with the mechanical spectrum, you can do it. These are published in, the results are published in Journal of Texture Studies. I also have some other links if you want to read more. You're welcome to upcoming conferences. And finally, I just want to acknowledge the Swedish Technical Board for NOVA for financing this work, and also my colleagues Anna and Emma for valuable help with the experiments. And with that, I finally want to thank you for your attention.